My goal in making these videos for you was to be more of an advisor for the audience on what I've learned along the way in my almost 30-year guitar journey at this point. One of those items that I found very interesting and also more informationally bound than what I had ever anticipated was buying my first vintage guitar. I've been fortunate enough at this point to own several vintage guitars, including late 50s Stratocasters, 60s Strats, 70s Strats, Les Pauls, SGs, all the way up to current. And what I found along the way is that not having the right information before you make these purchases can be a huge mistake, especially in terms of value of the guitar, reselling the guitar if it's not something that you enjoy playing once you acquire it. Also, since it's an aged instrument, there might be parts of the guitar that aren't functional that you weren't aware of that will either cost you more money from that point on in your initial investment purchase, or make the guitar unplayable as is, which would be horrible in that way. So I thought this would be a very beneficial video to make, and it was kind of inspired by my recent purchase as of this video, which was this 1973 custom color Telecaster. This guitar has a lot of unique variables in it, including having a needed refret that needs to be done on it to make it playable to my standards. So I thought it would be a really good example piece for our video today. Additionally, we're going to talk about reasons for buying the instrument, as well as alternate availability items that could improve your current gear to feel more like a vintage instrument, or just some other options in general that might save you a lot of money in the long run. So let's get started on the journey. The first segment of our discussion is going to ask the most important question coming into getting ready to purchase a vintage instrument, and that is, why am I purchasing a vintage instrument? The reason I say that that's the most important is because, as you know as a guitar player, the market is saturated with many modern options, including updated modern versions of vintage instruments like American Vintage Series from Fender, or Murphy Lab instruments from Gibson, custom shop from both parties that are out there, including boutique builders that make even relic versions of instruments that are meant to look and feel like a vintage instrument. So it's very important to ask that question as to why you want it in the first place. Is this going to be something that you're going to play out? Is this going to be something that you're going to display in an office? Or is it bring back a nostalgic feeling from your childhood, or maybe one of your heroes used it? I know those might seem like, well, what does that matter? It matters greatly, because think about this a lot like you're buying a vintage car or an antique home or something in that realm. Typically, vintage items require some form of maintenance or work that a new item does not require. And those items can become very expensive, especially if parts have been changed or parts have worn out, which we'll get into in the next segment. But that's the first question you need to ask is, why am I buying this instrument, and what am I going to get out of it by buying the instrument? The next area we're going to discuss is essentially what to look for now that we've answered that question as why we're buying it. We've decided, yes, we're going to buy a vintage instrument. Let's talk about why it's important to know what to look for. And this is a game-changing decision when it comes to buying vintage instruments, particularly vintage guitars, vintage amps, pedals, and so forth. So for instance, with the example that I brought up, this 1973 Telecaster, this had a few attributes that were very different than what was typically offered in 1973. First and foremost is the color. So Fender had colors that were known as custom colors, which is, I mean, today you see tons of Lake Placid blue Telecasters or Fiesta red Stratocasters or some of those colors that have become synonymous with the instruments that are available today. But back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, those were not readily available options. In fact, Sunburst was the most relatively available option or readily available option. So most of the time, a Sunburst Stratocaster or Telecaster is typically a lot less money to get into than what a custom colored Fender Telecaster or Stratocaster would be. So in this case, this is a custom color Lake Placid blue Telecaster, so it's very rare. Additionally, I'm covering the serial number just because, this is a 4-bolt Telecaster for 1973. So back in history of these guitars, when CBS, yes, that CBS that you see on TV, bought the Fender company, they started making some changes to the instruments for cost-cutting initiatives or aesthetic initiatives. One of those was to change it from a 4-bolt neck plate to a 3-bolt neck plate in 1972. So keep in mind that Fender was a very large company, still is, a very large company. So 1972 and 73 were transitional eras for Fender. So they had a lot of leftover parts from what are considered to be kind of the golden era of Fender, which is pre-CBS or the early point of entry of CBS buying Fender. And so some of those appointments were a 4-bolt or a 4-screw neck plate, I should say, as well as these pickups here. If you see, these are staggered pole pieces. So the magnets in the pickup itself are staggered. In 1973 onwards, most of these were done what they call a flat pole piece, so they evened them out. Now, does that change the tone a little bit? It's pretty marginal, but for a collector coming into these guitars, that's a big deal, especially from some of the most widely copied as well as some of the most desired pickups that are out there. There's nicknames like black bottom or gray bottom pickups. Black bottoms were pretty much prevalent pre-1966, and then post-1966 they went into an era of gray bottoms until, or I should say staggered gray bottoms, until a flat pole gray bottom was implemented. There's also red bottoms, which were from the early 80s until a certain point in the mid 80s, which, forgive me, I am not educated on, but it is available online. But my point is that certain appointments like this will increase or decrease the value of your vintage instrument. Now, frets, on the other hand, are something that are kind of known to be replaceable options. So like it's kind of like changing tires on your truck or your car. After a certain point, they wear out, and so it's kind of expected that if it's going to be a player's guitar, or there's going to be any sense of playing, that you're going to essentially replace those frets at some point. Usually those frets, when they need to be replaced, also require a new nut. The nut is here, which I'm sure you know if you're watching this video. The frets are here on the fretboard. Now, based on the year and the construction of the neck, replacing those frets could be a laborious task. So again, just to kind of showcase nuances, for 70s Telecasters or Stratocasters, Fender sprayed lacquer across the whole neck of the guitar, including when the frets were placed in here. So on a 70s Stratocaster or Telecaster that has like a maple neck where the lacquer was sprayed across the neck, to get those frets out requires a great deal of skill or a certain technique that is more laborious to do. So if you're stepping into that guitar, the point I'm trying to make there is if you're stepping into a guitar like this and you know that it's going to need a new fret job, you need to plan that in your budget when you're buying it if you plan to make it a player's guitar. Now, other areas that you need to look for as well are the potentiometers, or nicknamed pots, within the guitar. If that's your volume, your tone, are they the same? Is your selector switch the same? There were years that, for instance, Fender made a 3-way selector switch versus a 5-way selector switch. Is all the hardware on the guitar right for the year, or is it original hardware? Do your tuners still work? What kind of tuners are they? And have they been replaced? And if they've been replaced, have they been replaced by tuners that are reproductions, or are they actual tuners from the era? A really, really important one is the truss rod. Now, the truss rod is what adds or decreases relief to the neck for essentially making the action on the guitar. If your truss rod is worn out, you may not be able to adjust the neck, which again could make it a very difficult to play or unplayable instrument if that neck is warped, or if there are issues, from an adjustment standpoint. I actually know one of my best friends bought a vintage Strat where that happened, and it pretty much made the guitar unplayable. He had to get rid of it very soon after he bought it. And I'm sure a collector has it now in his home in that way. Pick guards. Pick guards, which is this portion here. Pick guards can warp or, over time. Keep in mind these instruments are old instruments, so temperature, anything that comes into play that could, make or break that pick guard, including just force in removing the screws and splitting the pick guard. That could ruin the value of that pick guard or make it less desirable to a future buyer. Everything even down to strap buttons, control, basically like this top hat knob for the switch. All of these play into a factor in what the value of the guitar is worth and its functionality. Now, if you replace these, is it going to make the guitar more playable? Absolutely. I would just suggest that if you're buying a vintage guitar and you have any part of the guitar replaced at all, make sure that your tech keeps those items in the case for you. So if they replace the frets, like I'm going to do with this, you need to make sure that they keep the old frets in the case for you. Does that mean you're ever going to use them again? Absolutely not. But it shows that you have the original parts if you ever plan to get rid of the guitar in the future. Oh, going back to the finish part, this is a really important piece of buying a vintage guitar because there's a lot of refinishing that happened not only by collectors, but just in the 60s and 70s, a lot of folks got into stripping the paint jobs of their guitars and either doing a lot of artwork on them or maybe just leaving them natural in a natural finish or painting them a color that they wanted more than what they had. Again, remember, sunburst was pretty much your color of choice unless you special ordered. So a lot of people did that, refinish the guitar. If your guitar is refinished, it decreases the value exponentially of the guitar, even if it's a custom color refinish. So it's very important that when you buy these, that you understand if it's a custom color like this, is it an original custom color? One of the best ways to check that is if you remove the neck of the guitar. In the neck pocket is usually unfinished. And I'll show a picture of the neck pocket on this guitar when I push this video out. but you can see on it that there's no other finish or other paint marks that are within the neck pocket of the guitar. Pretty much, if you can find that also if you remove pick guards, you remove certain parts from the guitar, you can typically see if there was any other finish that was put on it beforehand. That's a really good way to tell, if you're going to look at these guitars yourselves. Now, I would say that if you're looking to do this and get into one of these, and even though I've given you a lot of items to look for when you're looking to make a purchase on it, and I will make one more point on this. The screws themselves, if you have different screws that aren't correct, that decreases the value of the guitar. It's down to that minute of change. So just saying that when you get into this, it's very important that you know what you're doing. And so I personally would never buy a vintage guitar from someone that was not an expert in this. So I would go to a reputable dealer that would sell these, that specialize in vintage instruments. A couple that come to mind: Emerald City Guitars, Thunder Road Guitars, Carter Vintage in Nashville, Rumble Seat Music in Nashville, Elderly Instruments in Michigan. Those are all places that have a reputation for working with and handling vintage instruments. They know what to look for. They can show you pictures of when they take it apart, and they can show you all these nuances that I discussed. And in fact, I would ask them, like I did with this guitar. I purchased this from Thunder Road Guitars in Portland. They're an amazing shop. But I asked the owner, I said, well, can you send me pictures of the guitar? I'd like to see underneath the pick guard. I'd like to see the neck pocket. I'd like you to verify the pots, that everything's original. And they did. So I felt comfortable purchasing this Telecaster. Whereas if you see one of these for sale, like on Marketplace or on Reverb or somewhere that sells these instruments, that I would say like a private buyer sells these instruments, you really need to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row before doing that. Because like I said, if you do it and you make a mistake there, it could end up costing you thousands of dollars, especially if you get into like 50s or early 60s strats that are custom color. I mean, you could end up losing tens of thousands of dollars. So now that we've discussed that, let's go into some more considerations when buying a vintage instrument. Now that we've talked about what to look for and why we're buying it, let's talk about alternative options that are out there when looking to either get into the vintage instrument market or find ways to anoint your current instruments with vintage accessories, or even just going for something that's a lot different and still has that vintage look and feel. So in my personal opinion on vintage guitars is that what really makes a vintage guitar sound like a vintage guitar and feel like a vintage guitar are three distinct features. The first is the neck feel. Most vintage guitars have a really nice worn-in neck feel, so they just feel great to play, like you broke in a really good pair of dress shoes after a period of time. It's the same feeling playing a guitar neck in that sense. So having those years of wear on the neck really do add to the comfort when you're playing. Additionally, I really feel that pickups are the largest differentiator in buying a vintage guitar versus a newer, more modern guitar, even the custom shop or master built guitars. There was just something about the years that they made these, whether that be just the time that has done something to the magnets, whether that be solder that might have not been as safety compliant as it is today. Maybe there's more lead in it, the wiring, the pretty much I would say, just I think even it goes into the quality of craftsmanship that I believe people had back in the 40s, 50s, 60s that they just don't have today because everything is mass produced. So there is really something to pickups that come from these guitars, and that includes like vintage Gibsons or any type of guitar that is a vintage instrument that is available for purchase. I also have been lucky enough to play an actual 59 Les Paul, and I can tell you what I found to be the largest differentiator in playing that guitar was the neck feel and how the pickup sounded. Vintage Les Pauls, 59 Les Pauls, are quacky like Telecasters. So if I hear that spank or that quack that like a Telecaster pickup has come out of a PAF pickup, that to me sounds more vintage than, or more period correct than what I would hear some of the more modern PAF clones. I'm into it. Lastly is just the age of the wood. So as time progresses, wood dries out more, it becomes lighter, and there's just something about the tonal resonance of that wood over time. I know there's debates up and down about, well, what does wood factor into the tone of a guitar, or what does the weight factor in the tone of guitar, or just in general with that. That's like, there's so many debates about this. I can say just from my personal opinion that the vintage guitars that I played that are super resonant along with that, the pickup and neck feel, are really amazing and a really fun experience to play versus some of the more modern guitars that are out there today. Additionally, like we were talking about finishes and so forth, there is something about the finishes, the gluing, especially on like Les Pauls, they actually used horsehide glue versus some more modern adhesives in that way. So there are some factors too, as well as paint, nitrocellulose paint versus polyurethane paint that was more prevalent in the 70s, and even today there's a lot more polyurethane finishes that are available. So those all kind of go into the factors. So going back to what I was saying about what you could do in making your own instrument something more in line with a vintage instrument is really looking at first the neck and the pickups. So there are some really amazing pickup manufacturers out there. In fact, Throwback Pickups uses the original winders that they used in the Gibson factories and some of the the Fender factories to wind period correct pickups for guitars. There is an absolutely amazing amount of options out there. Personally, I think some of the best reproductions I've ever heard, and they're not very costly, are Lollar pickups. I think that you could put a set of Lollars in most Stratocasters or Strats, Tellys, Gibsons, and they sound phenomenal and very, very vintage sounding. I would say coming into that or making it a more vintage sounding instrument really do a lot to replace that added boost of tone that you're looking for, or give you that added boost of tone that you're looking for. Additionally, just having a good setup done, taking it to a good luthier that could maybe roll fret edges for you, do some relicking to the neck to add that more vintage feel, or dirty up the neck if you're looking for more of a type relic type job in that sort of factor. Those are all things that you can do to modernize your instrument. Additionally, there are a lot of clones of vintage guitars out there. My personal favorites, as you can see kind of through this wall and on my videos, I'm totally a Fender guy. I have some Gibsons, I have some other guitars like Dean guitars and Washburn guitars, but Fenders are typically my go-to. This guitar here is a Fender Masterbuilt built by Vincent Van Trite. This is a super heavy relic Telecaster. My buddies joked to me that it looks like it was burned in a fire. It's less than 7 pounds, which is amazing to play live. It's super resonant. The neck is amazing on it. It has modern frets on it. The hardware is all modern. It has Josefina Campos hand-wired pickups in it. So this is for an amazing instrument, and would probably cost you a third to a fifth of what a Telecaster, probably even a tenth in some aspects, of what a Telecaster of this level would cost you to get a vintage one of the same manner. So even though these are expensive, it does help out a lot that they're modern instruments. And I kind of look at these as like really like Resto Mod or amazing, like if you're looking at cars, like Resto Mod or amazing car kits where all the appointments are done. You get one of these, you don't have to worry about a fret job coming out of the factory, or your electronics having wear on them that need to be replaced, or pickups rewound, or you have a tuner that goes out and you have to go find a vintage correct tuner, truss rod issues. That's all set for you, so you don't have to worry about it in that way. Now they do make some other vintage type clones as well that some of the boutique builders are making, or I would say kind of mid boutique. Like for instance, Nash Guitars. Nash makes a lot of relics. Most of the relicing on Nash Guitars is a little bit overboard considering what would actually look like the natural wear that comes into it. I love Nash Guitars. I think that they sound great. They use Lollar pickups in them. The necks feel good. And again, they're a fraction of the price. So if you could get into a good Nash guitar for about $2,000 to $3,000, again, not cheap, but you could get into one for about $2,000 to $3,000 off the showroom floor. Whereas like a Fender Custom Shop or a Masterbuilt is going to be somewhere between $4,500 and now $15,000, depending on what builder made the guitar and the availability. And then lastly is just appointments that you could make to your own instruments. So if you have like a Gibson Historic, or you have a Strat that you're really looking to spruce up, as I was mentioning, you can just get a pair of throwback pickups or Lollars or Fralins. They're called Lindy Fralin pickups, or Seymour Duncan Antiquities are pretty good as well. So there's a lot of pickup manufacturers out there that are making vintage reproductions that you could easily just put into a guitar, take to a good luthier or your tech, put them in the guitar, or do it yourself, and it would really do a lot to make and refresh the instrument for you. I know a lot of historics can get converted to be more in line with the originals, like companies like Historic Makeovers. They'll go in and they will actually take your whole guitar apart, refinish it, reset the neck with the glue that was utilized back in the 50s. Now I know that with theirs, some of those pieces of it, they might not have original PAFs, but you can buy original PAF humbuckers, and those would cost you like $5,000 or more based on what it is. So it's, again, these are not cheap numbers coming into it, but if you think about a full restoration job by Historic Makeovers plus PAFs, your Les Paul might be $15,000, which again, a lot of money, but just to kind of compare that, the original 59 Les Paul that I played was listed for $310,000. So a fraction of the price of what you're going to get, but still sound and feel like those guitars. And I can tell you, playing the original 59 versus playing one of my friends that had one of those full reproductions, it's very marginal, the difference. In fact, if you probably put them side by side and didn't know one was an actual 59 versus the other being a conversion, you wouldn't know the difference. And most people that are listening to you won't know the difference either, and how that goes. So that just kind of goes to show you what you could do to spruce up your guitar, get closer to that vintage tone than what you might have today, and do it for a fraction of the price of what you would do to actually get into one of these instruments that are true vintage instruments. The last topic I really wanted to discuss about buying a vintage instrument or vintage guitar is to really consider the factors outside of the guitar itself of what provides to that tone. Keep in mind, a lot of these vintage players are playing some real, or vintage guitar owners and players are playing some incredible amps to support that tone, like Two Rocks or Trainwrecks, or some vintage Fenders like Princeton's or Deluxe Reverbs, and have probably some really good pedals along with that help accent those tones as well. So before you get into buying a vintage guitar and spending tens of thousands of dollars on an instrument itself, you may want to look at what your setup is and try the amp route before you go vintage guitar, because vintage amps and typically pedals are a much cheaper route to get the tones you're looking for, while also being able to have, and use the guitars or instruments that you're used to using. So what I'm saying is like, you could probably get into like a vintage deluxe reverb, like a 65 or 66 blackface deluxe reverb, for about $3,000 to $4,000 or $4,000 to $5,000, depending on what it is, or a Silverface drip edge reverb, which is actually my favorite clean amp. You could get into one of those for usually between $2,000 and $3,000, and that would significantly improve your tone depending on what you're using amp wise today. Also, big on pedals as well. There's a lot of different pedals that accent the tones of these players. Most are Klon inspired or Tube Screamer inspired overdrive wise. Some have some other variations like the Timmy that you might have heard me mention in other videos, or some of the new Vemurium overdrives are pretty incredible as well. But there's something out there helping to accent these tones. So just know that when you're going into buying a vintage instrument, or vintage guitar, that it's a amalgamation of all of these different factors that come into it. Additionally, your hands are a big part of it too. So remember that when you're listening to guys like Stevie Ray Vaughan and Hendrix and some of the Joe Bonamassa, these guys are experts at the instrument coming into it. So going with that route too is just playing that's just time, learning how to do more and devoting the time to learning those techniques and trying to get closer to what your favorite players are sounding like. So thank you for watching my video. That's my informative conversation on buying a vintage guitar. I thought that you thought it was, or I hope that you thought it was worthwhile to watch today. If you like what I'm doing here, please subscribe, like the video, and until next time.